Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. A live transcript for this program is available on Zoom for anyone who would like to use it. Just click Live Transcript at the bottom of the screen and click Show Subtitles. When you visit the Holocaust Center, we ask you to consider the land on which you are standing. The Holocaust Center for Humanity in downtown Seattle sits on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. I want to give a huge thank you to Verizon for sponsoring this series entitled Embracing Our Humanity and Diversity. Today's program is the last of 4. We are grateful for Verizon's support and we welcome all of the Verizon employees who are joining us today. Thanks also to our community partners, the Seattle Art Museum, the Northwest African American Museum, and the Wing Luke Museum. Thanks to our 2021 series sponsor, the Tacoma Jewish Community Fund. Today's program is also a part of our Day of Learning, a day of professional development sessions for educators. Throughout the course of the day, we are offering 5 sessions, including this one, to prepare and support teachers who are committed to teaching about the Holocaust and its lessons. Almost 200 educators from across the region signed up to participate in today's programming, and we welcome all of you to this Lunch and Learn session. We are grateful to the Powell Family Foundation for their deep support of our educational programming and their ongoing commitment to Holocaust education. It's been an honor to work with Nancy Powell and Carol Hiller of the Powell Family Foundation over the years. They have an insatiable desire to learn and believe wholeheartedly in the power of education. It's with pleasure that I now welcome Nancy and Carol to say a few words.
Hi, everyone. My sister Carol and I are so pleased with the number of teachers and community members joining this Lunch and Learn and lectures today. Thank you all for attending. A little history about us. Our European family, the Polotniks, survived the pogroms in Russia. Carol's in-laws, John and Georgette Hiller, survived the Holocaust. To highlight the importance of telling survivor stories, Carol's mother-in-law, Georgette Hiller, who is still alive, just met a woman she walked out of Auschwitz with during the death march, Helga Stern. They live 1 hour apart in New York. Yad Vashem filmed their meeting, and it should be available soon as Yad Vashem puts together their story. So it's really important to keep these stories alive, and survivors are still here with us. And this was really an amazing gift through social media and the archives in Paris. We have been dedicated to teaching the Holocaust for about 15 years. The most important thing for us is that the teachers and community members are able to teach some of these lessons with their students, and the community members, please share the lecture, anything that you got from this. It was really important because education for us is the most important tool we have. So we are so pleased for the lectures today. And thank you, Kendall, who's gonna have a lecture following. And we just look forward to a day of learning with everyone. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy and Carol. Today, we are fortunate to have with us Kendell Pinkney, YouTube star, rabbinical student, artist, and so much more. What I love about what Kendell is doing is that he's doing the same kind of work we are doing at the Holocaust Center. He is looking at history, turning it over and over to see all of the angles, challenging us to look beyond the obvious and to see how and why it's relevant, and even critical for us to continue pursuing and understanding. You might have seen Kendell in the 2020 viral Saturday Night Seder with over 1.5 million views. Kendall Pinkney is a Brooklyn-based theater maker, Jewish life consultant, and rabbinical student at the Jewish Theological Seminary. In addition to his creative work, he is the rabbinic intern for the Jewish arts and cultural organizations Reboot and LABA, LABA, and serves on the spiritual direction team at Ammud, the Jews of Color Torah Academy. Kendell will take questions at the end of the program. Please type your questions into the Q&A at any time. Thank you so much, Kendell, for joining us today from Brooklyn.
Thank you so much, Alana. And thank you so much to Carol and Nancy for your words as well. As Alana mentioned, I am joining from Brooklyn, which is on the ancestral land of the Lenape people. And it's really such a honor to be here with you all today, especially with so many wonderful educators. I'm an educator myself, and what's more is I think about my life and the arc of my life. And honestly, if it weren't for educators who stepped in at various points in my life, truly, I can't imagine what my life would be. So I'm beyond delighted to be with you all today. So, as was mentioned, I'm Kendell Pinkney, and I am, among other things, a rabbinical student and also an artist, creative producer. And it's really interesting to be with you all today, speaking about the topic or the set of topics that we'll cover today. The title today is How to Use the Master's Tools or Not. And this is, in essence, going to be a bit of time for us to spend together to reflect on Jewish tradition and reflections on reparations, specifically as they relate to reparations for Black individuals who might be the descendants of slaves. But before we get into that, I kind of want to give a little bit of an introduction to get us into the mood to do a little bit of study today. And don't worry, for those who are wondering, you will not need to know Hebrew in order to follow along. So here we are now in June, and sending all of my thoughts to you all who are in the Pacific Northwest who are feeling the heat right now, sending you cool blessings from the other coast. So we're 15, 16 months into an altered reality. Here we are in this pandemic, God willing, towards the end of the pandemic, at least in some meaningful fashion. And here we are about 12 months after the social foment that led to a racial reckoning after the murder of George Floyd, and so many others who were also killed as well. But one of the things that has really been reinvigorated in this last year, as I'm sure you all know, is that there are conversations around what does the US owe to Black people who are the descendants of slaves. Over the last decade alone, we've had a lot of powerful writing on this. I know that many of you know the work of Ta-Nehisi Coates, maybe you know the work of Nicole Hannah-Jones, or even more recently, you have the work of William Darity Jr. and his From Here to Equality, even though Professor Darity has been working in this field for a long time, or even Susan Nyman, who wrote the book Learning from the Germans, where she's able to draw out some very significant and interesting parallels while also noting the differences between claims for reparations for Black people who are the descendants of slaves and for Jewish people who are the descendants of Holocaust survivors or are Holocaust survivors themselves. So it's been very interesting, especially as someone who is Black and Jewish, to be aware of all of these conversations that are happening now, and to also sometimes hear the way in which rhetoric is used in order to say, well, actually, comparing the Holocaust and comparing slavery, this one, they shouldn't be compared. This one is worse or that one is worse. And I mean, I'll be honest with you, I very much have a perspective where I think it's really important for us to recognize the differences between the different historical realities. And yet, we should also have a certain kind of openness to being able to see or learn lessons where we can from the various historical realities. So with that being said, and given the fact that I am not a scholar of the Holocaust, nor am I a scholar of slavery, I am a rabbinical student and an artist. So I'm actually going to share my perspective looking at a handful of sacred texts in order for us to wrestle with these ideas of reparations, or even more broadly than that, how is it that we think about justice whenever there has been harm done, whether that is by an individual or whether that is done by the state? So in case it isn't clear, we are not going to settle a complex issue like reparations in the course of 45 minutes together. Rather, this learning is meant to be an offering, a kind of shorthand way to relate to and engage in these ideas and questions around justice, reparations, in a somewhat different way. So with that being said, I just briefly want to outline what we're going to do together and how I'm going to move between the various texts that I'm going to share. It will be a lot of text. I will, one, try to make it as interesting as possible. Two, there's no need to read very, very deeply into the text. I will draw out some of the nuggets that I think can be really useful for us. And as I said, do not worry about Hebrew. For those people who might have Hebrew, there will be, Hebrew translations of many of the texts. So you can feel free to look there, especially if you have a question that comes out of that. But I think there's going to be something to learn from these texts for all of us. So we're going to look at 3 sets of Jewish texts ranging, they were written over the course of many, many years. And they're going to present different models for how we might go about repairing a society when harm is done. And then finally, before we close, we're going to look at one story that addresses a somewhat different thing. It addresses the fallout that can occur when shame is used as the primary tool for enforcing repair. I'm going to explain that last part a bit more clearly once we get towards the end. So stick with me, and I hope that it will be useful learning for all of us. So finally, before I hop into the text and share my screen, I want to acknowledge we might touch on some things that might be uncomfortable. There might be a feeling as we go through this. You might feel maybe your face is starting to flush. Maybe you feel your heartbeat getting a little faster. I just want you to pay attention to what is happening in your body, take care of yourself as needed. And if you do feel that there is something happening inside of your body, it's okay to just breathe through it and take care of yourself, because it's really, I think what's really important is finding some way to engage with this, but also hold yourself and be kind to yourself as you're entering into some of these ideas that can be at times maybe a little challenging. So with that being said, I will go ahead and share my screen and we'll begin to hop into some of this text together. Okay, so here we are. I hope that all of you can see that very well, and I'm sure that if you can't, that I will see the chat lighting up very, very quickly to let me know that you can't see it. So our presentation today is on how to use the master's tools or not, Jewish tradition and reflections on reparations. I want to start out with a couple of quotes that I find especially illuminating as I think about these Jewish texts that we're going to hop into. And these are 2 texts from contemporary thinkers who I consider my rabbis of sorts. The first one, of course, James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. I know that this is a quote that is being used quite often these days, and it might seem obvious, and yet it's one of these quotes that could be repeated and repeated and repeated again, because really, this is what our work is before us. We need to be able to face the past, to be able to learn from it, right? Now, the second quote from another rabbi of mine, the inimitable scholar Audre Lorde, from her lecture, The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. This is a very popular quote. It says, survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to stand alone, unpopular, and sometimes reviled, and how to make common cause with those others identified as outside the structures in order to define and seek a world in which we all can flourish. I love that line, in which we all can flourish. really focusing on human flourishing. It is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. Now, interestingly, this quote has been used in so many different ways by people who make the claims of, oh, actually, this is maybe making a claim for, in fact, using the tools of the system in order to dismantle the system. And it has been used by others to say quite the opposite. You actually need to use tools that are outside of a system, like, say, an education system or something like that, in order to bring about real change. I will leave it to you all to wrestle with this and see where you think this lands. But from here, we'll go on to our first text. Okay, so as you might see along the side of the page, you see this word reform. I'm actually going to frame the three sets of texts that we are going to look at today according to a dichotomy. We're going to have one side that is representing what I call the reform idea. The reform idea, in essence, would state, okay, maybe there's something off in a system. Maybe there's something wrong with the system. But the way that you address that and the way that you address the harm that is caused by that system is actually to reform it. I probably don't need to go into too much detail as to some contemporary examples of that. So I will leave it at that. And then, as you might expect, if I mention reform, then I'm also going to mention revolution. So the other sets of text are going to deal with revolution and comparing those two. So this first text that we're looking at is the story of the daughters of Zulophichad, okay? All that you really need to know about this is that this is from the biblical book of Numbers, which is in the Jewish and Christian Bibles. And this is a really interesting story about a group of daughters, sisters, who end up being dispossessed of land by virtue of the fact that they are not born men. And at this time in ancient Israel, whether it is a real history or a mythic history, these women could not inherit, only sons could inherit. So I'm going to read this and then some brief observations about what is going on in this text that I identify as a reform text. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and read. Okay, the daughters of Zulophichad came forward. They came forward before Moses. Zulophichad was the son of Hefer, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, son of Joseph, a member of the Manasseh clans, begat, long lists of lineages. The names of his daughters were Machla, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. So we have 5 daughters. One thing to note, inside of a lot of biblical scripture, we rarely get women named. Sure, we get some famous women like in the book of Ruth, the book of Esther, but in a lot of places, they might be named because of their relationship to men only, such as the wife of X or the daughter of Y. So it's interesting that we have the name of 5 women here in this moment. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and all of the congregation. These are all of the ancient Israelite leaders at the entrance of the tent of meeting, which was a place where often there were ritual sacrifices that were made. And you would also go there to seek an answer from God according to this ancient religious practice. And they said, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korach, but died for his own sin, and he had no sons." So the story of Korach is, in short, about a rebellion that happened amongst the Israelite people in this ancient time. In essence, what they're claiming is, our father was golden, had nothing to do with this rebellious group of people. So he died and was not connected with them. So then they say, why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers. And so when they say that why should the name of our father be taken away from the clan, that means he will inherit no land, because the land would be broken up against all of the male descendants and sons. So by not having land, the father's territory would not go on in perpetuity. Moses brought their case before the Lord. And the Lord spoke to Moses saying, the daughters of Zulophichad are right in what they are saying. You shall indeed let them possess an inheritance among their father's brothers and pass the inheritance of their father on to them. This is pretty big. In this text, we see that God is telling Moses, okay, remember some laws that I told you earlier? And in fact, God told Moses earlier that there was a law of how land is passed on from father to son. God is seemingly changing the law, changing God's mind, seemingly, and saying that the daughters of Zulophichad are right and that they deserve to inherit on their father's behalf. Continuing on, you shall also say to the Israelites, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall pass his inheritance on to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest possible kinsman of his clan, and he shall possess it. It shall be for the Israelites a statute and ordinance as the Lord commanded Moses. So what's interesting for us to note here is that on the one hand, we see that there is the reform of a system. You have a group of daughters, a group of women, a group of sisters who band together in order to go to the leadership and say, this isn't right. Then the leader, Moses, takes it to God, and God's like, you know what, that makes a lot of sense. And so the law changes. So on the one hand, this reform, this challenge has led to a reform. And we see here, it says it is a statute and an ordinance that is meant to continue forever. However, as some of you might be noting from reading this, like, is this really changing the system? At best, this is kind of granting these sisters a change and granting them kind of the fruits of their father's, gender, so to speak. In fact, the system is still in place. When we look here, it says, if a man dies and has no son, then you pass it on to the daughter, but sons are still preferred. So this kind of gets into the question of, okay, maybe this was great for the past, but is this really meaningful? Should we look to this as kind of like the moral guidepost as people who live in the 21st century? Maybe what we have here is insufficient. So this is a reform text, as I said, a text that speaks about how do you reform a system that has done some kind of harm. Now, what I want us to do is look at two texts that I identify as revolution texts, okay? So our first text, actually, even before I start talking about the text, I should note that these two texts that I'm going to share, I am sharing them from this perspective of thinking about reform and revolution when there has been social harm. In the case of these next two texts, in their original context, the authors were not thinking about broad social change. Rather, they were thinking about how does an individual change their spiritual makeup in order to do good. So I want to name that I am using it in a different context. But as a theater maker who learned from some really wonderful theater makers at NYU Tisch School of the Arts, with all plays, as soon as you put your play out there, it is open for interpretation and open to being used in order to make different arguments. One could even possibly argue that Martin Luther King Jr. did that very thing regarding the Constitution, right? And regarding the broad American civilization and the texts that are considered foundational to it. So just acknowledging that. So our first text that we're going to look at as a revolution text is the Netivot Shalom. And this is written by Rabbi Sholem Noach Berezovsky, who is a 20th century rabbi and a prolific writer. Here's what he writes. A person wants to build a magnificent home on a rotten piece of land. So we're already in the realm of parable metaphor. If he doesn't want to invest a lot of money and dig a foundation that is deep and solid, this building will never have a strong infrastructure. As a result, cracks will constantly form in the walls of the house. And time after time, he will have to invest significant amounts of money into strengthening the building, even though he will never see any real benefit from these improvements because there will only be new breaches revealed, and the whole house will stand in constant danger of collapsing. I think we see where this is going. Eventually, he will only have one option before him. He will need to have the courage to break down the entire structure of the house and to dig foundations that are deep and strong upon which he can truly build a house. So this seems to be pointing to a notion of like, sometimes the foundation upon which you stand is so wrecked, is so rotten, that the only thing you can do is actually to completely disassemble it. Now, let's go on to another text that's going to kind of present this in a much more succinct form. So Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who is an 18th century rabbi from Italy, wrote the following: "For one who wishes to effect a complete cure for an illness, this person must seek out its cause, after which he is in a position to remove the effect." So I think that this is representing some of the revolutionary sentiment that we see maybe amongst certain activists, or even for people who are not necessarily activists, but think that, you know, when it comes to reparations for the Black Americans who are the descendants of slaves, and for just what's going on in American society, they're saying, you know what, we're not sure that we can actually do this reform thing. Rather, we need to tear the whole thing down. Once again, I don't want to claim this is what these rabbis are saying, but rather they're making an argument that could be used in a very useful way in order to just frame this for our thinking. Now, I'm going to go on to our third text, which is actually going to speak to the tension between these two perspectives. And the reason that I want to do it is because, one, in a lot of Jewish text, especially a lot of Jewish text of the rabbis, there's often seen as this real benefit by having the tension between multiple perspectives. Even if a certain perspective wins out, you always have a minority perspective that is there, that is considered a legitimate perspective that has something to teach us about how we live our lives, about how we communicate with each other as human beings. So let's go on to this final text, which is one of my favorite texts that's going to figure out this balance between reform and revolution. Okay, so this is a text from this text called Gittin, which is what's called a tractate or a big old chapter of the Talmud. So the Talmud is this big collection of legal and narrative materials that cover so many different aspects of Jewish life. Whereas the Bible is a very, very ancient text, the Talmud is also ancient, but a little less ancient, whereas the Bible was probably completed by 586 BCE in kind of many forms. There might have still been some, tinkering going on here and there, but there was a lot of compilation by that time. The Talmud is more around the 5th or 6th century of the Common Era, so something much later. Now, the text Gittin is a large text that often deals with a lot of the legal provisions around divorce within Jewish communities in ancient Babylonia. That's where this was compiled, in ancient Babylonia, so modern day Iraq, Iran. Okay, so here we go into this text that balances reform and revolution. The Mishnah teaches that Rabbi Yochanan ben Gudega further testified about a stolen beam that was already built into a building, and said that the injured party receives the value of the beam, but not the beam itself. Okay, so there is a stolen beam. Someone's creating some building. The beam, at least a beam inside of that building, is stolen from somewhere else. Okay, so Yochanan ben Gudega is of the belief that the person who had the beam stolen from them, they should be given the value of the beam. They should be paid for it, but the beam shouldn't be returned. With regard to this, the sages taught in a baraita. A baraita is a different tradition. It's like an additional tradition inside of ancient Jewish literature. So the sages taught if one robbed another person of a beam and built it into a building, then the Beit Shammai, which means the Academy of Shammai, who is a great scholar, great ancient scholar, said he must destroy the entire building and return the beam to its owners. And Beit Hillel, the school of Hillel, this great ancient other rabbi, says the injured party receives only the value of the beam, but not the beam itself, due to an ordinance instituted for the sake of the penitent. What does that mean? I think we get a sense of, the house of Shammai, Beit Shammai. They say, look, this beam is stolen. This is enough of a ruined foundation. Get rid of the whole thing. Beit Hillel says, there's something uncomfortable in this. Like, should we really tear down the whole building? Especially, let's think about the fact that inside of the Talmud, there are certain buildings that you're actually not supposed to tear down except under very specific circumstances. For example, an ancient synagogue. So the injured party thus receives the value of the beam, but not the beam itself. And this is meant in order to also give the person who stole the beam the chance to say, I'm sorry, to make good for stealing the beam. Now, it's interesting that we have in this text this real tension between what I call reform, which would be Beit Hillel, pay for the beam and do restitution, and Beit Shammai, which is revolution, tear the thing down. It's built on the wrong foundation. However, let's think about our own situations today. This might be an interesting model to play with, but what happens when a society is really based on a system that goes beyond more than stealing a beam? It would be one thing to steal a beam and build a building out of it. It's another thing to steal human beings and build an economic system out of it, or to steal the property, the ancestral property of First Nations, and then build a state on top of it. So we see that in our own American example, even though this can be a useful way of thinking about it, we obviously live with greater complexity. And the question that rises from this is that when the damage of a system is so severe, is there any appropriate form of restitution? And many of you all as teachers have studied the Holocaust quite a bit and have studied the fact that even though there is actually a claims conference that has sought to restore the materials and material wealth that was stolen from Jews in certain European countries. Because many of you have taught on the Holocaust, you know that there are any number of Jewish individuals throughout history who have said, I want nothing to do with that. How is it that you can actually repay me for what I lost, for the family I lost, for the friends that I lost? Is this supposed to make something good? No, to you and your restitution, I turn my nose to you. And so this is really kind of addressing us in this moment right here, where when our systems are so severe, or the damage can be seen as so severe, is there any appropriate form of restitution? But one thing that I want to point out, if we notice here, the rabbis might not know exactly what the appropriate response is, but they do say something must be done. So there are some who might make the argument of like, honestly, it's too complicated, nothing to be done, let's wash our hands of it. But in this case, the rabbis in this particular case are saying, actually, one says reform, the other says revolution, but there is agreement that at least something must be done. Now, we've talked about revolution, we've talked about reform, we've talked about this within the context of Jewish texts and how that might provide some interesting heuristic for how we think about reparations for Black Americans who are the descendants of slaves. But I can imagine that there's at least one or two people on this call right now who are thinking about, okay, this sounds great, but this is also terrifying, right? because we're living in a time where the rhetoric is so hot that it seems like the operative tool that many people use to have these conversations is shame, right? And is, some people might use the term cancel culture. And so you're wondering, how do we negotiate between all of these things, all of these concerns? Maybe we want to do something, but I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing. I'm afraid of doing the wrong thing and where it leads. So I'll be honest, we're going to make mistakes. And hopefully we are able to be generous with each other. But one thing that I do want to share is a very famous rabbinic story, also from the Talmud, that is maybe used in a slightly different form than people might expect for those who have studied Jewish text, and particularly the Talmud, in their past, because I think it says something specifically about shame and the fallout that comes from shame as we try to build a beloved society. So I will switch to a different text because I didn't want to put this one on the PowerPoint because it might just be far, far too much text to view on slides. So give me one moment. And here we are. I will endeavor to make that a little bit bigger so people can see me. And I'm sure that if you are not seeing this new screen, that I will have many people in the chat telling me change the screen. Okay, so here we are in this final text. This is from Bava Metzia. Bava Metzia is another big old book from the Talmud that actually deals a lot with matters of law and property, among other things. So talking about reparations, this feels maybe a little relevant, right? So we're going to read through this story that is going to be about what happens when shame goes beyond a certain point. And I think it might be able to bring us a little bit more context for what it is we just discussed. So here we are. Apropos of the topic of verbal mistreatment. So earlier on, there was a long section about verbal mistreatment. We learned in a Mishnah there, a Mishnah is an early teaching of rabbinic legal teaching. If one cut an earthenware oven, so back then, ovens were made out of earth, widthwise into segments and placed sand between every segment, Rabbi Eliezer, an ancient rabbi, says this is ritually pure. So this is a legal pronouncement that Rabbi Eliezer made. Because of the sand, its legal status is not that of a complete vessel and therefore not susceptible to ritual impurity. And the rabbis deem it ritually impure as it is functionally a complete oven. The only thing you really need to know about those particulars is that Rabbi Eliezer says this oven is pure. And the other rabbis, all the other rabbis are like, not so much. It's not pure. We go on. And this is known as the oven of Achnai. Now, I have condensed a much longer, very, very beautiful story that I would encourage everyone to, go check out on their own time. So here's the part that I summarize. The Gemara, which is another name for parts of the Talmud, goes on to relate a story where Rabbi Eliezer seeks to convince other rabbis to follow his halachic, also it means legal, ruling by the demonstration of miracles. Rabbi Eliezer knows that he's right regarding this oven being pure. So what does he do? He demands that a carob tree uproot itself. The carob tree uproots itself. He demands that a flowing body of water begin to flow backwards, and it does. He demands that the study walls of the walls of the study house collapse, and they do collapse halfway. Finally, Rabbi Eliezer demands that the voice of God speak out and declare that his legal ruling is right. So in essence, all of these things Rabbi Eliezer says is like, I'm right. If I'm right, let the carob tree remove itself. Let the water flow backwards. Let the walls of the study hall fall down. Let God's voice speak, and God speaks. But still, the majority does not listen to Rabbi Eliezer. What's very interesting, and a piece that I don't include here, is that when it's asked, what did God do when the larger group didn't listen to God? God laughed. God was impressed that the group was able to stand up to God's ruling. But that's often where the story ends in a lot of places where this story is taught, but I actually think there's something very interesting to learn after this point. Let's continue. The sages said, on that day, the sages, the rabbis, brought all of the ritually pure items deemed pure by the ruling of Rabbi Eliezer with regard to the oven and burned them in the fire. And the sages reached a consensus in his regard and ostracized him. So the sages all come together. They're like, you've been ruled wrong on the oven, so we can't trust anything else you've said. Everything else you've said is pure. Boom, in the fire, burn it. And the sages said, who will go and inform him of his ostracism? Who's going to go inform him that he has been kicked out of the rabbinic assembly? So it's not only your rulings are bad, you are banished from society. Rabbi Akiva, another great ancient rabbi, his beloved disciple, and by that it's the beloved disciple of Rabbi Eliezer. So Rabbi Eliezer's student says, I will go unless some other unseemly person goes and informs him in a callous and offensive manner, and he would thereby destroy the entire world. Whoa, that's big language. Let's see what that means, destroy the world. What did Rabbi Akiva do? He wore black. He wrapped himself in black as an expression of mourning and pain. This was pretty common back then. It's still common in some communities today. As an expression of mourning and pain, and sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 cubits, so the length of a forearm, which is the distance that one must maintain from a person who has been kicked out of the community in this particular, ancient Jewish community. Rabbi Eliezer said to him, Akiva, what's different about today from all other days? Like that you do this in this manner? Like, why are you sitting so far away? Rabbi Akiva said to him, my teacher, it appears to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you. And distancing is a euphemism because actually they distanced Rabbi Eliezer from them by saying, your rulings are bad, you are bad, stay away. Rabbi Eliezer too rent his garments and removed his shoes, as is the custom of a person who's been kicked out of this ancient community. He dropped from his seat and sat upon the ground. So intense mourning. The Gemara relates, the Talmud relates, his eyes shed tears. And as a result, the entire world was afflicted. 1/3 of its olives were afflicted. 1/3 of its wheat was afflicted. 1/3 of its barley. And some say even the dough that was needed in the hands of women spoiled. The sages, the rabbis taught, there was a great anger on that day, as any place that Rabbi Eliezer fixed his gaze was burned. Wow, these crazy signs and miracles are happening because of the way that he was treated. Even though God is allowing this to go on, remember from earlier. Now, skipping to the final point of this little section of the Talmud, and I would have us really listen closely to this. All of the gates of heaven are apt to be locked, except for the gates of prayer for victims of verbal mistreatment. So on the one hand, the Talmud gives us this sense of like, the majority won the day. The majority were the ones who were able to declare that this oven was impure, even going against God. But the way in which they treated Rabbi Eliezer after was such that there was a breakdown of community in a deep way. There was plague, there was fire, there were all of these things that happened. And to end our time together from looking at these texts, I want to take it back to something a bit more contemporary. Seems like I'm on the slightly wrong sharing screen. So give me one moment while I figure that out. Okay, anyways, I'll apparently need to stop it in order to share it. And let's see if I have it there. Okay, I'm seeing that it is not showing up. Nevertheless, the point is actually very simple. And only because I actually love this quote so much, I'm going to take the moment to find it. So if you all will bear with me for just one moment. Okay. Thank you for your indulgence. Okay, here's the final thing to share. It is human nature to want to feel worthy of love and belonging. When we experience shame, we feel disconnected and desperate for worthiness, full of shame or the fear of shame. We are more likely to engage in self-destructive behaviors and to attack or shame others. So, the final thing that I will say about this, as we kind of bring it all together in this last moment and get to some questions, is that whether we are between thinking of reform or revolution or what reparations might look like in our day-to-day, one of the things that I think is really important, and maybe I sound very much like a rabbi in thinking about this, is we also have to be very conscious of the ways in which we hold each other in the process of trying to achieve beloved community. Because when we are having to learn about such fraught things from a place of shame, we often shut down. We often can't handle it. Now, I know that to some extent we might think of this in terms of maybe white fragility or any number of other terms that might be useful. And yet I think there's also enough very interesting psychology studies that show that there's something about the human psyche that shuts down when it becomes combative justice as opposed to invitational justice. With that being said, those are my final words for my teaching today. And thank you all so much for the chance to speak with you, to be in community with you. And I look forward to some of your questions and answering if I happen to have anything insightful to say at all.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kendall. There was so much really thought-provoking information in there. And I want to just start by asking you a question about one of the last things you ended with, which was invitational justice. Can you give us an example of what that means?
Sure. So now let me first start by saying that I actually do think it takes all kinds of people to be involved in this work. So some of my, this is going to sound weird, some of my best friends are activists. No, but actually, I'm very close with a number of people who I self-identify as activists, and activists from the perspective of racial justice. So it's not me saying that, oh, we need to be kind and the activists are doing it wrong. So I just want to be very clear about that. But I would say a lot of the people who I have worked with, including a lot of people who are across some kind of political spectrum, I can tell that there's good intention there, even if there isn't a sense of knowing exactly what impact is or how to move forward in certain work. And so I think that there's sometimes the inclination to say, like, maybe I don't have the chance to educate you on this, you need to do it yourself. You know what, I don't have the time to hold your hand or make you feel good or give you a cookie about your privilege. You just need to sit here, you need to listen because I'm going to tell you my truth. I actually think it's really important that we hear these truths. And I think that one of the things we have to also hold in the other hand with that is making sure that we invite people into this work of justice. So when I say invitational versus combative justice, I want to invite people to be part of this work together with me, to be in the work of justice, to share their stories and to hear my stories, so that way we can find where it is we aligned, and where we don't align, maybe we can get into the conversations about, well, is that actually a reason for us to not work together? Whereas I think that for combative justice, sometimes it can be like, you know what, if you use the wrong words, I don't actually want to work with you, even if we are aligned on 95% of what we care about, or even 99% of what we care about. So I think that's what I mean when I say invitational justice versus combative justice.
Yeah, I love that concept. I hear what you're saying. It's like inviting people into the conversation without the shame, which, as you said, to come full circle, is only going to push people away.
Absolutely.
So Kendall, we have a question here from Noemi, and she says, thank you so much. I have learned so much, and I would love to one day have you as my rabbi. My question is, how can we integrate these teachings into our own personal spiritual practices, and how can we share them with younger members of our community?
Wow, Noemi, thank you so much for that. And I'm glad to be in community with you. Wow, sharing it with younger members. Okay, so your own spiritual practice, like I know that not everyone on here is Jewish, and yet I think one of my favorite quotes that comes from Ethics of the Fathers, which is one of those early groups of sayings by Jewish rabbis, in essence says, wherever you can learn some wisdom, take it. So this isn't like wisdom that is only for Jews, for Christians, for Muslims, no, this is like wisdom that we can all feel free to share. So whatever your religious tradition might be, even if you have no religious tradition, I think what I would say is maybe this way to wrestle with this in a spiritual way or a meaning-making way, to use in more secular terms, is maybe to ask the question, what perspective is not represented here that is really necessary? What I did was I kind of presented a binary option and then showed the tension between the two of them. And then I brought in something about how it is we have conversations about race. So for me, I think that's one way, just framing it like that. Two, I always frame it as a conversation. I have had people want to have debates with me live in, on YouTube or whatever. I'm sorry, I'm not into the rhetorical gestures of debate or showing my virtue or things like that. Rather, I want to be in relationship with people. I love the fact that there was this notion of like flourishing inside of Audre Lorde's comment. And that's what I'm committed to. I'm committed to mutual flourishing. So I often frame it conversation, relationship, what voice is not heard. And the same with our young people. Our young people sometimes get this feeling of like that we kind of have ageism, like in the opposite direction. It's called, I guess, adultism with them. Like we don't take them seriously and that we use our authority over them. Be in relationship with them, conversation, because they bring wisdom and different perspectives as well.
So Kendall, you touched a little bit on this, or at least alluded to critical race theory. And it's such a polarizing topic in our community right now. And I'm wondering, thinking of that, how would you conceive of these two very polarized sides maybe finding some middle ground? Do you have any recommendations for all of us out here?
So, you know what? It's really hard. Let's just start by naming it. It is so freaking hard. Personally, I'm not a scholar of critical race theory. So I know a touch. I did some undergrad study that touched on it, but I don't know it to really be able to like say, this is bad versus this is good. But I know that the one thing that I try to live out in my life is try to live out deep compassion and trying to understand, even though it tests me. For example, my best friend since 6th grade happens to be a conservative who has always voted very differently from me. And at times that has been so incredibly hard. And yet, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, this individual, this man who I have known since I was a 6th grader, like called me to check in on me. How are you doing? How are you doing, my friend? I know I don't, and also did the beautiful thing of saying, I don't know if this is affecting you in a certain way, but in case it is affecting you in this way, know that I'm here for you. I love you. And so like the basis of that relationship, because we became so close prior to, I guess, developing our politics, made it to where it's like, we can be in relationship despite the fact that we are on such different sides of the thing. So I think the bigger question is, if we really, do we actually believe that the beloved community is possible anymore? Do we actually believe that America is possible anymore? Do we actually believe that human flourishing is possible anymore despite difference? Now, I can't answer that, but my approach would be, I don't exist on any social media, so I only get a hint of what goes on there. But I'm like, whenever someone says something in real life that I disagree with, my place is also like, huh, tell me more. I still remember, in fact, I'll just share this anecdote only because it was meaningful to me. I was at a convention with where there were a lot of people there who I disagreed with, but I was part of a fellowship, so I was like there. I sat next to these two people who happened to be white. One happened to be Jewish, one happened to identify as Christian. They were married, where they were, in essence, trying to show their virtues in order to see if I agreed with them on their conservative politics. We started having a conversation. I was asking them questions. And then one of them said, I don't see race. Now, as many of you are probably like, you might want to roll your eyes and be like, oh, at that time I was feeling generous. And I was like, let me ask more questions. As I asked them more questions, I was able to get them to clarify what they actually meant. And I said, interesting. So you're saying that you want to see me because of the content of my character. But when you say that you don't see race, what I hear is you don't see me. And I want you to see me. Like, I want to be able to have that. And these people who will never vote the same way as I do said, wow, you know what? I actually never thought about that. This is really interesting. Now, did I change their hearts and minds? Probably not, but I think that I at least nudged them in some small way. But how do we scale that up? The only way is relationship.
Mm-hmm. That's so meaningful, and that makes it so personal. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, that's really important. Kendall, this has been wonderful. If people want to find out more or like hear your thoughts or connect with you, where can they find you?
So I, you know, funnily enough, since I don't exist on social media, and I am in the process of working on my website, what I would say is that you can actually find me on via one of two platforms. I happen to be the rabbinic fellow at Ammud, the Jews of Color Torah Academy, which is a Torah academy that does a lot of work with Jews of color, where the teachers are Jews of color. Whole different thing to talk about. But if you go to Ammud, which is spelled AMMUD.org, you can find a way to reach me via email there. Furthermore, if you want to reach out to my email at JTS, I'm happy to be in contact with anyone. It is K.E. Pinkney, that's P as in Paul, I, N as in Nancy, K, N as in Nancy, E-Y, at jtsa.edu. Happy to be in community with you all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kendall, and thank you to everybody for joining today's program. For those who are teachers who are joining today, I dropped a link in the chat if you want clock hours for this session, or if you've already registered for the other programs, you might already be registered for clock hours. I want to give a special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who's running the technical side of this show behind the scenes. And also a huge thank you to our Executive Director, Dee Simon. Thank you to our entire team at the Holocaust Center for Humanity, Lori Rochelle-Cohen, Nicole Bella, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, Ellie Selesky, Amanda Davis, Rick Brewer, Katie Lawrence, Morgan Romero, and Craig Vernice. I hope you will join us actually next week. We are taking the week off. So please join us the following week on July 13th for a special program entitled Resistance Fighter and Holocaust Survivor, Carla Pepperzak in conversation with Dr. Ray Sun. Again, that is July 13th. There'll be no program next week. And Carla was recently honored with a middle school being named after her in Spokane. It's a wonderful story. I hope you will join us for this very special conversation. This concludes our program for today. Thank you so much for joining us.